to be here, just because what you all are doing in practice, focusing on details, is a spiritual truth of our country.
You know, we can be Democrats and Republicans, but most Americans are patriots.
For over a decade now, good ideas have emanated from the BPC.
Thank you for convening this very impressive group of thought leaders.
Your organization has brought together leaders from across our society to advocate for common sense solutions to our most challenging problems.
Because if it's bipartisan, it's much more likely to pass.
When you have people philosophically and ideologically in two different worlds, and they put them together on a committee, that committee usually is not very productive. Once we get staffs blending, and John and I, they know that the members are friends and we talk, things can happen.
Thank you, Anand, for that introduction, and to the BPC for its important efforts.
Thank the Bipartisan Policy Center. You guys are great.
We all have bipartisan responsibilities to this nation, to defend principles that have long made America the beacon of hope.
It's going to take all of us to try to turn down the temperature and really focus on what unites us.
Good day, and thank you for joining us for a discussion on the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit, and specifically how policymakers could strengthen both their administration and the compliance and audit process for the millions of American workers and families eligible to claim them. I'm Rachel Snyderman of the Bipartisan Policy Center, and it is my pleasure to welcome you today on behalf of BPC and the National Academy of Public Administration and its Center for Intergovernmental Partnerships. I also want to take this opportunity to acknowledge H&R Block, the Robin Hood Foundation, and the W.K. Kellogg Foundation, for whom without their support, the research and dialogue presented today would not be possible. While today's event is entirely virtual, we encourage active participation from the audience via the live stream and using the hashtag BPCLive and Twitter handle @BPC_bipartisan. The CTC and the EITC help American families offset the high cost of raising children and support workers with low or moderate wages, and have been truly hallmarks of bipartisan success. In fact, they've been expanded multiple times since their enactment with the backing of both parties, given their successful track record of reducing poverty. Here at BPC, we have worked tirelessly over the past 2 years on policy development around tax credit reform. And since the release of our report last year that provided a roadmap for policymakers to permanently reform the EITC and the CTC, we have focused on ways since to improve credit uptake and administration. And on behalf of my co-authors, Andrew Carruthers and Emily Wilk, I'm proud to release BPC's newest research today that dives deeper into this issue of administration and offers concrete recommendations for policymakers to consider. While both the CTC and the EITC have made significant dents in the fight against poverty, administrative barriers hamper their effectiveness. And a variety of factors, including program complexity, widespread non-filing, lack of awareness and misperceptions of benefits that are administered through the tax code, and language barriers contribute to their incomplete take-up. Additionally, persistent levels of improper payments afflict both programs. And while some are fraudulent, many are honest mistakes that are made by individuals confused by the credit's intricate rules. For example, approximately 1 in 4 EITC dollars each year might either go to people who are ineligible or to filers who receive more than they should by law, which is often due to improper claiming of children whose attribution for household tax purposes is governed by enormously complicated regulations. Policymakers have a responsibility to address these varied challenges, and the package of reforms that we released today could not only increase credit take-up among eligible Americans, but combat improper payments and humanize the audit process at the same time. Among potential reforms, 6 include bolstering the IRS's administrative capacity for social benefit programs and improving customer service and VitaSite staffing and funding, increasing coordination between all levels of government and the private and nonprofit sectors, while streamlining the process of claiming state and local versions of both the EITC and CTC. Strengthening technology resources that people use to access public benefit programs, permitting the IRS to certify and regulate paid tax preparers, modernizing complicated eligibility requirements and data sharing practices between all levels of government, tax authorities, and third parties, and specifically those surrounding income and child eligibility. And lastly, investing in IRS customer service throughout the compliance and audit process, including for low-income taxpayer clinics. We recognize that this research comes on the heels of Congress still debating the future of these two programs and last month's passage of the Inflation Reduction Act, which provided a monumental investment of nearly $80 billion in additional funding for the IRS. It's within this important context that we look forward to hosting a robust discussion today about the role of not only both parties, but both the executive and legislative branches, state and federal governments, and the private and nonprofit sectors who can all work together to improve the administration of the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit. And with that, I would like to turn it over to a woman who knows principally what it's like to wear all of those hats, Terry Curtin, President and CEO of the National Academy of Public Administration. Terry, I am honored to have you introduce our keynote speaker today.
Thank you, Rachel, and thanks for everybody for joining us today. As Rachel said, I'm Terry Curtin, and I'm the President and CEO of the National Academy of Public Administration. And I'm delighted to be here to promote the partnership between the Academy's Center for the Intergovernmental Partnerships and the Bipartisan Policy Center, and to support their work on this important topic. For those of you who may not know, the Center for Intergovernmental Partnerships is the Academy's resource aimed at promoting improved governance, communication, and collaboration at and across all levels of government. Today's event is a perfect example of that type of issue. Tax credits, such as the child tax credit and the earned income tax credit, are vital bipartisan mechanisms for alleviating poverty in the United States. But as Rachel said, despite the support from across the aisle, many administrative challenges keep the credits from achieving their full potential. The recommendations within the BPC's paper will help ensure that these credits are accessible to all, equitably distributed, and efficiently managed from an administrative and auditing perspective. And to speak further on some of the challenges and successes around those tax credits, I'd like to introduce John Koskinen. John is an Academy Fellow and former Commissioner of the Internal Revenue Service. He's a dedicated, lifelong public servant who has spent over 45 years working to support good governance across agencies and all levels of government. In addition to his time at the IRS, John worked as a city administrator for the District of Columbia, Deputy Director for Management at the Office of Management and Budget, and Chairman of the Board and Director of Freddie Mac. John, thank you so much for being here today, and the stage is yours.
Well, Terry, thanks for the introduction. A brief summary of my what I call checkered employment career in the public sector as we go along. And I'm delighted to be here to talk about these two important programs. I would note at the start that the Bipartisan Policy Center's report coming out today is a thoughtful and detailed analysis and report with recommendations that I think everybody should pay attention to and take a look at. These are two critical programs that a lot of people really aren't very much aware of, but they're designed, both of them, to encourage low and moderate income families and workers to work and to reward work. So they are designed to be tax credits, refunds, tied to the amount of money being earned by the taxpayer and the number of children they have. And as noted, these are very large programs. The two of them together excuse me, have the IRS issuing over $100 billion a year in credits and refunds. And as Everett Dirksen is reputed to have said years ago, $1 billion here, $1 billion there, pretty soon you're into real money. So the challenge, excuse me, for the IRS and for the programs, excuse me, I'm going to drink water here. The challenge is to actually get enrollment up and increased, and at the same time make sure that the right people are getting the right amounts of payments. As the report notes, and as the IRS has been working on for some years, the take-up on the one hand is very large, 90% of eligibility for child tax credits the families apply, and about 80% of the earned income tax credit eligible people apply. But that still leaves millions of eligible taxpayers who aren't participating in these programs and taking advantage of them. One of the great ironies is that these basically social welfare programs designed to combat poverty are administered by the Internal Revenue Service. Most people think of the Internal Revenue Service, to the extent they think about it at all, primarily recognizing its tax collection and tax enforcement function, which is important. That the IRS collects over $4 trillion a year and basically funds the vast amount of what the government does across the board. And then people are sometimes familiar with the IRS in its other significant function, which is taxpayer service, trying to help taxpayers become compliant. As I've always said, if you're trying to be compliant, the IRS is anxious to help you. Well, most people don't think of the IRS as a social welfare organization. In addition, recently with the stimulus payments that the IRS paid out, the IRS actually issued almost the same amount of money as the Social Security Administration did with a smaller budget for that effect. So it is an important part of the IRS operations to try to ensure both that the number of people applying is as large as and the percentage is as high as possible, and also that the money is going to the right people in the right amounts. But the underlying pending part of this program, as Rachel noted, is it's really bipartisan in nature. People on both sides of the aisle always make a reference to what, again, may be an apocryphal story, that the Earned Income Tax Credit was Ronald Reagan's favorite anti-poverty program. And to some extent, I think that explains why, even in the face of fairly high improper payment ratios, the program continues to receive bipartisan support. The improper payment ratio for the child tax credit is about 14%, still high, but more manageable. But for the Earned Income Tax Credit, the percentage is 24%. Now, not all of that is being stolen. The reason that people are somewhat comfortable with that is a lot of the money does go to the right sector of the population, but perhaps not to the right people specifically and in the right amounts. And so the IRS has been focused on this and trying to deal with it for some years. It's on the General Accountability Office's high risk list, which doesn't help. And every time I testified at various times, I'd get asked questions about why can't we do better about it? And we made a lot of progress in a lot of ways at the Internal Revenue Service while I was the commissioner. And Andy and I were talking before we started. One of the areas in which we made great progress was dealing with identity theft and refund fraud. And we created at the IRS a public-private partnership with tax preparers like H&R Block and others, as well as the state tax commissioners, on the theory that the IRS couldn't deal with identity theft all by itself. And so for the first time, we really had a working partnership called the Security Summit. And the net result, while I was commissioner, was the percentage, or the number of victims of identity theft went down by over 60%. And I'm told the number now is down by over 80%. So that's a lot of taxpayers who are benefited by that. But we also spent a lot of time trying both to increase the uptake, particularly on the Earned Income Tax Credit, and at the same time, make sure that the right people got the right payments. And we made almost no progress there, no matter what we did. And in fact, I held a 2-day seminar bringing in the Government Accountability Office and advocates and people concerned and people who knew something about this. And I challenged them to figure out what we could do differently, particularly on the improper payments area. And I said the test was, could they come up with something better than my suggestion, which was that we redo the statute totally. And at the end of the 2 days, nobody had a better idea. And part of the problem, having read the statute, is it's almost impossible to figure out how to apply for the credit and to whom the credit should go. The statute, understandably and appropriately, tries to make sure that the people who are taking care of the child get the credit. But the problem, as everybody knows, is these in low-income areas are complicated family situations. A lot of times you have a single parent who's working and supporting their children. There are grandparents, uncles, aunts, neighbors, a lot of different people taking care of those children who move around to some extent. And so it seems to me that even if you try to simplify how you figure all that out, it's always going to be difficult. And that's part of the reason that sometimes you have two people applying for the same child because they're taking care of that child for a significant part of the year. So my suggestion then and continues to be, I don't think we're ever, going to be able to sort through from afar by statute how to allocate appropriately the credit. And so if you're married on December 31st, you're married for the whole year and you file jointly. It doesn't matter when you got married during the year. Similarly, my thought has been for a long time, if you're taking care and have custody of your child on December 31st, you get the payment. And as I've said, you would then let the family sort out who's putting in more time or effort or financial support for the child, and each family will be different and they'll make their own judgments and determinations. But it would make it a lot easier for the taxpayers, for the preparers working with the taxpayers, and certainly for the IRS if the standard were simplified significantly. And that, I think, would increase the participation, because part of the concern by people thinking about applying is that it's a complicated statute. They're concerned that they may not get it right, and that if they don't, they're going to get audited by the IRS. And recently, thanks to the budget cuts and the decline in the number of employees generally, and in particular, the decline in the number of IRS employees able to answer the phone, fewer than 20% of calls are answered. In fact, some estimates are last year only 11% of the calls got answered. So if you're a low-income taxpayer, a little concerned about whether you're doing this right, and you want to call somebody to get help, the last couple of years it's been impossible to get somebody at the IRS. So as noted, the IRS now has $80 billion provided over the next 8 to 10 years to make improvements across the board. And one of the first places those improvements will get made is to hire more people to answer the phones, to answer those questions. And I think that would help. But I think also what happens is that what you have, a lot of taxpayers, low income particularly, are going to preparers to get help. And they're not going necessarily to H&R Block or Intuit. They're going to somebody who set up shop in the local parking lot, or to a relative who may or may not know anything about the earned income tax credit. And in fact, we saw some preparers with signs saying, "Come with me and I'll get you a refund." And a lot of times those unprepared preparers would file for refunds far greater than the taxpayer was entitled to. The preparer would disappear when the IRS would send a notice saying, "Hey, this doesn't look right," and the taxpayer was left on their own. So one of the things the Bipartisan Policy Center has recommended, that we recommended strongly, was that the IRS begin an authority to require minimum competence and standards by all preparers if they're going to prepare a return. I used to stress we shouldn't necessarily call it regulation, because everybody gets very nervous about, wow, what are they going to do with all these preparers? It's really just a question of making sure that every year they demonstrate their understanding of the basic rudiments of tax law, particularly in low-income areas. They understand how to apply for the earned income tax credit for their clients and the child tax credit. And if we could do that, I think that would eliminate a significant amount of the improper payments. And to the extent that taxpayers had more confidence that the person in the local community center actually knows what they're doing, they might be more willing to say, okay, I'll take my chances, because now my preparer knows what he or she is doing. And the statute has been simplified in a way that even I could kind of figure out that I'm really entitled to this credit. So they're critical programs. 25 million or more Americans benefit from these programs. And I think it's important on both sides of the equation, as the BPC report notes. We need to make sure that everyone eligible understands the programs and applies for them appropriately. And we need to make sure that as they apply, that the improper payment rate goes down and the system is made as seamless as possible, with the IRS providing as much service as possible to the taxpayers who have legitimate questions. And oftentimes those questions will come from their preparers, who will have a fact situation that they would like to check before they actually make the filing. Right now, that's almost impossible. Fortunately, with the additional funding, I would hope that we're about to see a significant change in that regard as well. So we have a panel with a lot of background and a lot of different perspectives on this. And so, like everybody else, I'm delighted to listen to what they have to say about these very important programs. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Commissioner Koskinen, for those incredibly insightful remarks. It's really an honor to have you here to speak with us today. And the former commissioner is going to join us in just a bit for our audience Q&A. But for now, I would like to bring in our panelists, who each bring a rich and diverse experience and host of expertise as practitioners and policy experts across the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. First, we have Andy Phillips, who is the Director of Agency and Industry Relations and Virtual Tax Services at H&R Block's Tax Institute. In this role, he oversees a highly qualified team of tax experts, attorneys, CPAs, and enrolled agents who study the ever-changing tax laws so that H&R Block can support its network of 70,000 tax professionals, its suite of tax through tax preparation products and its millions of clients that it serves. Next, we have Gabriela Lastres, who joins us from Houston, Texas, and is a senior policy advisor for the Office of Harris County Judge Lena Hidalgo. In this capacity, she was part of the team that created the Harris County Child Tax Credit Outreach Program, which leveraged American Rescue Plan funds to help low-income Houston families access free tax preparation services to benefit from the expanded CTC in 2021. Let's also welcome Rebecca Thompson, who is the Vice President of Strategic Partnerships and Network Building at Prosperity Now, where she leads efforts to engage and grow the diverse array of stakeholders that make up Prosperity Now's networks and the economic resilience and justice fields at large. She previously led VITA coalitions in North Central and Northeast Florida, which included managing a coalition of tax sites that prepared over 20,000 tax returns in Northeast Florida annually. And I also want to welcome Isabel Dixon, who is an economic mobility specialist with the Colorado Department of Public Health and Environment's Maternal and Child Health Program. In this role, she identifies and implements strategies to improve economic stability and mobility for Colorado families, including strategic state and community level partnerships to increase enrollment in services that support economic well-being and improved health outcomes. Thank you all so much for joining us today. And as a reminder to our audience, we encourage you to submit questions via the live stream using our hashtag BPC Live, and to engage with our Twitter handle at BPC_bipartisan. So let's get right to it. The commissioner, the former commissioner alluded to this, and I did as well in our introduction, that throughout the course of our research, one of the primary areas that we were investigating was the fact that the IRS has been cash strapped for a number of years and needs bolstered investments and new funding. And the Inflation Reduction Act that was passed just last month does this by providing nearly $80 billion in new funding to address really longstanding concerns over weakening tax enforcement, subpar customer service, and outdated information technology, as the commissioner remarked. And so now that we have policymakers' attention focused on taxpayer services, I was hoping that each of you could speak to this new funding and, from your perspective, across various sectors and levers of government, where these resources should best be directed in the context of improving tax credit administration and the audit process. And so maybe, Andy, we can start with you, and then we'll go to the remainder of our panelists.
Sure, happy to start. First, thank you so much, Rachel, and to the Bipartisan Policy Center, my fellow panelists, and then, of course, Commissioner Koskinen for joining today, and for all the work that went into this paper. It's a fantastic work product, very thought-provoking and insightful. So I think some others, I'll let others talk a little more about opportunities for outreach, and I'll speak a little more tax administration, if you will. And so, I think first, just kind of starting with opportunities on the administration of the credit and modernizing the taxpayer experience. Electronic tax filing leads to electronic processing on the IRS's side. This is much more efficient and accurate for the IRS, and it's much faster for taxpayers. In addition, when errors are discovered during this process, they can be addressed in a much timelier fashion. However, every year, a large number of taxpayers have a tax return that would otherwise qualify for electronic filing, but they're not able to do so because they experience an e-file reject from the IRS. And there's a variety of reasons, but there's a few that are most common. And I want to talk about one that really plays in here very, very closely to what we're talking about today. In a situation where there's a duplicative claim for a dependent, I think Commissioner Koskinen talked about that in his opening remarks. That can be due to ID theft. Maybe a bad actor has stolen the identity of a dependent. It could be a mistake due to complexity, an honest mistake, if you will, confusion around the rules. Or it may be two potentially eligible filers who disagree about the outcome of who should claim that dependent. Well, in Block's experience, so let me go to what happens there. First, taxpayer files, and they're able to claim that dependent on their tax return for child and family-related benefits, and they're able to file electronically. Any subsequent filers are rejected, and they have to submit paper to the IRS, which results in a substantial delay in the amount of time it takes them to get their refund. and process that tax return. In Block's experience, many times the legitimate filer is the one that gets rejected, particularly in situations where it's not honest mistake. The bad actor is rushed to file, right? And they've beat him to the punch. And so then that legitimate filer has a manual and long process to prove that they're eligible to claim that dependent and the associated benefits. That can cause economic hardship while they're waiting for that tax refund. In addition, the IRS, because that first return that was the illegitimate return was filed electronically, it's very possible the IRS has already processed that return and issued the refund payment. It's going to be very hard to collect that. So looking at opportunities to enhance electronic intake of tax returns for IRS is better for tax administration from an IRS perspective and is better for the taxpayers. Just a little bit on the audit and post-filing process that was referenced in this question as well. First, and this is referenced in the report, like over 150 million hits go to the IRS's Where's My Refund application every single year. There's some helpful information in there for taxpayers whose return follows the happy path. If you maybe you're getting flagged because the IRS has more questions about a refundable credit that you've claimed on your tax return, you may have no idea until that notice comes in the mail. So expanding what's available and Where's My Refund for taxpayers to know what and why if their return processing has hit a snag. And then secondarily, I think the paper, I don't think the paper talks a bit about the undelivered notices or the notices in the EITC audits that don't receive taxpayers. So harnessing the IRS's digital capabilities and the continuing to expand services available in the taxpayer online account to deliver digital notices to allow taxpayers a more effective way to address when the IRS does have a question about a credit or other item claimed on their tax return. For sake of time, I'll stop there and let others speak a little bit as well.
Great, thank you so much, Andy. And I'd like to really pose the same question to the remainder of our panelists. Gabby, I'll go to you because I know that you're coming on the heels of just helping, a number of families through the intricate process of claiming and trying to understand ever-changing tax laws, specifically as it comes to the CTC and the EITC. So I would love to get, your perspective on where you think, the IRS should be focusing its resources.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, we took advantage of the American Rescue Plan Act funds that we received as a county and leveraged those to invest about $500,000 into a program to conduct outreach and really reach the hardest to reach individuals who need that help filing. And I think the expanded CTC that happened under ARPA was special circumstances because it was a whole new population of people who were eligible, with the very lowest income people who are inherently the hardest to reach often. There are transportation barriers, language barriers, time barriers, and when people are available to get these services. And so we had a very take it to the people approach. We wanted to remove as many of those obstacles as possible. So we invested in our largest nonprofit VITA provider and had them go do pop-up clinics in schools, in churches, and other places of worship. Really target the census tracts and zip codes where we knew there was the lowest take-up of VITA and other tax preparation services, and really try to reach out to those people and go to the same sites over and over again so that people knew they could come back next week and which papers and information they needed to bring. And the language barriers too, making sure that there was hotline with multiple languages, English, Spanish, Vietnamese, Chinese, and that there were preparers who spoke each of those languages. And we had really great success, more than we had anticipated. So we had over $13 million in tax credits that brought back in during effectively a 6-month program. So we were excited to see that, but we, more than anything, saw it as a test or a pilot for what else is needed to reach the people who don't get access to these services. What are some of the barriers and ways that we can help? And local government can help in many of these instances, but I think, having funds, federal funds, in this case, ARPA and other forms of federal funds can really help, especially for smaller jurisdictions where there might not be a large presence of preparers. In jurisdictions like Harris County, where there's massive transportation barriers, and we're a very diverse county. We have a lot of different individuals of different ethnic and racial backgrounds, language backgrounds, and so I think being able to really get the funding we needed in order to support expanded access was incredibly helpful.
Wonderful, thank you. And Isabel, I'd love to hear from your perspective, the state of Colorado, given where you think kind of IRS should be focusing its newest investments.
Yeah, thank you. It's great to be here. I'm from the State Health Department, and we're really focused on connecting more Coloradans to tax credits and tax filing to improve their economic well-being and their health outcomes. And we already have the networks and programs through our public health and human services programs and partners that do benefits enrollment and can help get the word out. But what we see on the ground in Colorado as we do this tax outreach and then training of care coordinators and navigators, and also what we hear from our volunteer income tax assistance partners, our VITA partners at the point of filing, is that the complexity of filing is intimidating. And it really drives potential filers to paid preparers or not to file at all. It's a real barrier. We also see a lack of awareness of eligibility and a fear of engaging with the IRS, a fear of filing incorrectly, and a concern that other benefits they have might be impacted. So anything that can be done to simplify the process and provide clear and less intimidating information from the IRS and the state departments of revenue would be helpful. And to Gabby's point, in multiple languages. And, with the caveat of acknowledging that there are IRS administration challenges that we don't know about in detail as advocates, is it possible to do something like sending refund payments or tax bills and sorting it out after the fact if there's a dispute, pre-filled returns? I don't know what the hurdles are to that, but simplified portals like what IRS created with Code for America for Get CTC to help people get their stimulus and their child tax credit could really help. The number one click for next steps in filing on our campaign landing page is free do-it-yourself online software. So how could that be supported and expanded? Easy do-it-yourself portals that could be accessed in public settings like libraries. And I also want to call out that the navigators and care coordinators we work with, workforce development offices, human services, county offices, they can really be averse to talking about taxes and to making these referrals, even though they're referring to other benefits like SNAP and WIC and TANF, because they fear making a mistake or giving bad information. They worry that they might be liable for giving incorrect information. And we want them to refer to tax filing just like they do to other supports. They are often asked questions about custody and they don't know the answers. And even though we stress in our trainings of care coordinators and navigators that you don't have to be a tax expert to refer to tax, very simple IRS guidance to refer to would be helpful. And addressing common concerns of potential filers, that it doesn't affect future citizenship or affect other benefits.
Wonderful, thank you. And Rebecca, I obviously want to turn it over to you because you're a woman who I think, when we're thinking about these issues holistically through multiple different sectors of the economy, trying to reach all households who are eligible to claim these credits, and especially with your background and your expertise and VITA site staffing and resourcing, would love to hear kind of your thoughts on where the IRS should be focusing its resources now.
Certainly. Good afternoon, and thank you so much, Rachel, and to the Bipartisan Policy Center for bringing this panel discussion today. I have a list of ways in the areas in which I think this funding could be useful for the IRS and where these resources could be best put to use. The first thing I would say about it is that one of the key aspects of this funding is that it is multi-year in nature. And working in the nonprofit sector, I think, it's very important for us to be able to have multi-year funding because a lot of times the work that needs to be done cannot be accomplished within 12 months. And so I think it's wonderful that this is actually multi-year funding, which allows for projects to begin and continue all the way through completion. Within the IRS, I want to piggyback on what some of my colleagues have said earlier about the improvement in back-end digital processing. That's important for those of us, those returns who can go through the e-file process and make it through the e-file process, that the IRS really needs to come into this century and this age with regard to their legacy systems. And I know they've been working from systems that have been around since probably longer than I have. And so it's really important that our government agencies and the IRS particularly is operating with systems that are current and consistent with what the rest of us are using. Another real key important use for these resources in hiring. We've all heard about the challenges with answering the phones that millions of American taxpayers face when they call the IRS after they've received a letter, or if they're inquiring about, what's happening with their returns, that they just cannot get through on the phone lines. And so it's really important that the IRS really step up their hiring. And I know they are hiring. They have been trying to hire throughout the course of this year to deal with the backlog. And so it's really important that they have competent, capable staff who are competitively paid on the back end to answer the questions, to answer the phones, and to be able to respond to taxpayer questions when they come in. One of the other things I was thinking about as Andy was speaking was about what happens when, that return gets kicked out of e-file and it has to be a paper return. Many of us have seen the photos of the cafeterias stacked with paper returns and paper that the IRS individuals staff have to manually go through and process. So I think it's really important that some of this funding goes towards improving the processing of paper returns. I'm not sure that we'll ever completely move away from paper, because there are some people who are, insistent upon filing a paper return, and there are some situations that do require that paper return. But the 6-month, 9-month process, probably a year now process to actually get those returns processed could definitely be improved upon, and that will help to ease some of the burden until we fix this other piece of the EITC and the CTC filing and the rejects. And then the last thing I think where these resources would really be helpful is in the hiring of specialized qualified auditors to audit the high income and high net worth individuals who have avoided paying their fair share of taxes, and which will actually lead to us actually closing the tax gap in our country, and actually hopefully alleviate some of the pressure that I think we'll talk about with the audit process on low income taxpayers as well.
Yes, that's actually a great, great segue into my next question, because I want to bring up this issue of paid tax preparers, and the fact that we know that more than 3/4 of paid tax preparers are in fact unenrolled preparers. Individuals who are not subject to government certification, training requirements, ethical standards, or competency tests, like the former commissioner noted. And we know that this presents issues of quality that disproportionately affect low-income individuals who are utilizing these paid preparers at higher rates. And so we know, for example, that the IRS currently lacks the authority to regulate unenrolled tax preparers, and that's one of the recommendations that we make in our paper. Granting the IRS this authority actually has strong bipartisan support from both outside and inside Congress, but Congress has really yet to take any action. And so I was hoping that each of you could speak to your experience, given that you do represent such intricate, different levels of touch points with taxpayers, and how this issue in particular of unenrolled tax preparers has contributed to the issues that eligible claimants face, and how providing the IRS this authority could actually help reduce improper payments and improve the audit and compliance process and the claiming experience, really, if you will. So Rebecca, maybe do you want to start us off, just given that your beautiful segue, and then I want to definitely bring in the panelists' perspectives.
Certainly. Thank you so much, Rachel. At Prosperity Now, we have long supported the regulation of paid preparers, consistent with our support for the VITA program. I can say for certain that the VITA accuracy rate consistently has been above 90%, even during our COVID years. We may have dropped to 93%, but at our height, we were at 98.6% accurate on returns. I have yet to see a stat that really gives us a good accuracy rate for paid preparers. The last one that I saw was around 60%. So we know that there's a lot that's happening with pay preparers that doesn't necessarily lend itself towards accurate returns. Quite often what we see during the filing season are shingle shops, what we used to call shingle shops, that set up during the filing season with these unenrolled pay preparers. And you could go through and actually take a look at the IRS's Dirty Dozen and probably almost check off about 6 of those things that are on the Dirty Dozen for things not to do and what pay preparers shouldn't be doing that are occurring within those shingle shops. Now, I often think about nail shops. I like to get my nails done, nail shops and barber shops. And every time I go in to the nail shop, every time I take my sons to the barber shop, there's always a certificate that's hanging on the wall that shows that, you know, they've gone through the necessary training, that they're certified by the state board in order to be able to deliver this service. And it just baffles me that pay preparers actually have the ability to be unenrolled and that they don't have to go through a similar process, particularly when they're handling financial matters and it is a financial interaction with the federal government. That actually does lead towards actually widening the tax gap. So I absolutely, we support the regulation of pay preparers. I think it's something that the IRS definitely should have the authority to do and should actually, you know, take the time to actually enact some of the regulations against those pay preparers or for those pay preparers and actually educate them as well along the lines so that we can actually minimize or reduce the number of improper payments that are coming out.
Gabby, I want to then turn to you to get your experience, you know, given the expanded credits in 2021 and the number of households that you were able to reach with your program, and kind of how this issue of unenrolled tax preparers was layered with that.
Thank you, Rachel. Yeah, I think Rebecca brought up a lot of good points. It's understandable, I think, that so many families and households end up working with, you know, paid preparers that are unenrolled, because who are you going to trust? You know, this is, especially if you're low income and you don't have that much money and your cousin says, oh, I can help you with your taxes. That's a trusted entity. I think especially for marginalized individuals, for folks that have language barriers, they're going to go to someone who can help them instead of trying to reach out to organizations they may have never heard of, and they don't know if they speak the language and they don't know if they can trust them with very personal information. So I think it's twofold. I think absolutely it would be helpful to have, you know, more kind of oversight and resources for tax preparers to get the information they need and become enrolled. But I think it's also about, you know, making sure that folks have different options and are aware of the different resources they have for preparers. So our local VITA provider that is a nonprofit that services about 60% of VITA tax services in the county, they were seeing the same 98% of their customers were the same year after year. It was the same people who were already aware of them. So in doing this program, yes, it was a one-year program to take advantage of the expanded child tax credit under ARPA, but we also saw it as an opportunity to get out the word. You don't need to, you know, rely on your cousin. There are other options where you don't have to you know, pay money. You can get good, you know, solid work out of a local trusted nonprofit organization that can speak to you in your languages. And I think, you know, Isabel raised this earlier about how a lot of individuals who are undocumented or mixed status households may not know that they can file taxes and doesn't have adverse consequences. I think the flip side of that is that if someone who isn't properly trained is helping you with that, there are unfortunately consequences for immigrants if they misrepresent something on their tax returns that is effectively committing, you know, fraud on a federal document. And so that could have unintended consequences even if they didn't do so intentionally. And so I think having a trusted provider that can talk to them about their specific circumstances is particularly important in some communities like the immigrant community. So I think letting people know that they have multiple options outside of just, you know, paid providers, and then also making sure that those preparers are as trained as possible and that there's oversight to help folks enroll.
Thank you. No, I couldn't agree more on those points. And Andy, I want to bring you into the conversation because I know that this is a topic that you've done a significant amount of work on throughout your career, and H&R Block is out there. You know, it really is a leading voice to educate taxpayers, obviously tax preparers as well. And so would just love to gain your insights. And then we'll take a question from the audience, Isabel, that I'll have you answer if that's okay.
Sure. So I think, Rebecca made a really salient point there that, the licensing and training requirements for someone to cut your hair, while very important for most people, aside from maybe myself, is higher than what it takes to handle what is the most important financial transaction of the year for many taxpayers, right? But I think first, there may be an opportunity to obtain more detailed and comprehensive data on this topic via maybe an updated GAO study. Much of the data today is kind of anecdotal in nature and based on surveys, targeted secret shoppers. So I don't know that holistically we understand the unenrolled preparer population, everything that it entails, and what opportunities may exist. But that said, tax preparer standards can include continuing education requirements, and ideally, I want to touch on a little kind of a subtopic of this, a more effective P10 revocation process. So a P10 is your preparer tax identification number that you have to get to file returns with the IRS. There's no training or continuing education required for that, but it is how they identify you. And the IRS today really lacks an effective mechanism to rescind P10s for paid preparers that target on different subsets of taxpayers that intentionally commit fraud, or those that just aren't totally trained up. And so you have a subset of unenrolled preparers that are able to continue filing fraudulent tax returns with the IRS, oftentimes with states as well, or they're unenrolled preparers that are making honest mistakes because they're not choosing to and they're not required to stay up on their continuing education and training. So there's plenty of opportunity here, particularly looking at training requirements, revocation for the bad actors. But what some of the others said, I think is worth reiterating, is what we have somewhere around 700,000 or so unenrolled preparers. A lot of them are providing an incredibly valuable service. They do stay up on training. They're passionate about serving taxpayers, their clients. Oftentimes they live and work in the same community as them. They may be family members. And so it's important not to vilify all unenrolled preparers, but to tailor the solution to the problem that we're looking to address.
I couldn't agree more, and thank you for that helpful insight. Isabel, I'd love to bring your perspective for the state of Colorado into the fold, and also address one of the questions that we received from the audience about whether or not, if federal regulation on this issue isn't moving, what opportunities can states take on in that absence? And also, happy to bring back the former commissioner into our question and answer as well, if he has any perspectives on this issue following Isabel.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. I mean, all of our legitimate outreach efforts are impacted by fraud when potential filers can't tell the difference between legitimate services and paid preparers who either don't have up-to-date information or are actual bad actors. There are opportunities, I think, to answer the question from the audience. There are opportunities for states to take action around this, and there are advocacy partners and legislative sponsors who care a lot about improving the tax code, about making it easier and more accessible for people to file their taxes. And I could definitely see, and state agencies have a part to play as well, because we all care about similar objectives of supporting the resiliency and financial well-being of Coloradans. So I do think there are opportunities for advocacy organizations to convene interested partners to push something like this forward. And just to echo Rebecca, that promoting and expanding VITA more, including volunteer recruitment, would be really helpful from the IRS, from advocacy and state organizations, linking to service organizations that could support more volunteerism. We've had great success partnering with AmeriCorps to help fill the gap in volunteerism for VITA. which is down across all service programs right now.
Wonderful. Thank you. And Andy, I know that you wanted to share a few perspectives on this issue as well. And former Commissioner, I'd love for you to, if you would like to as well after.
Andy, be my guest.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, Commissioner. All right, I'll be brief and let him back clean up and hit a home run. And so, on this, I'd say several states are doing this. And one thing is that they really vary. And is it registration? Is it testing? Is it continuing education? And an increasingly mobile world where tax professionals serve taxpayers across the country, you have, I think it was Gabby that spoke to a lot of times this tax professional customer relationship is something that's grounded in trust, particularly when you have a year-over-year relationship. That doesn't go away because the tax professional or the customer or taxpayer moves to another city. So you have a lot of situations where they're not necessary. And we have the advent and which has really been expedited with the pandemic of all these virtual tools, be it, Zoom that we're on today or other things like that allow us to communicate and be face-to-face hundreds of miles away and from the safety of our homes during the heat of the pandemic. And so when you have a patchwork of regulation across many states, it's a lack of cohesive and consistent rules, and a lack of, sometimes a lack of awareness on tax preparers' parts of where all do they need to be registering. So I think there's certainly an opportunity to take learnings from the states, but it may be a more effective process if it's one unified set of rules that tax preparers are expected to follow.
I think the discussion's been very good. I think Andy's point's well taken, that what you worry about when you get individual state regulation or minimum standards is you get a patchwork. And some states won't have any, some will be very good and very sophisticated, and it'll be very difficult for the preparers to work their way through it. So my hope would be that if we start with states, that might motivate the government, federal government, the Congress to say, we really need a single standard. And as I've said, it doesn't have to be couched as regulation per se, which always has people think of a heavy-handed arm of the government leaning on you. It can be basically requiring minimum standards, making sure that tax preparers are qualified and prepared. And I think presented that way, it's a little harder to argue, no, we ought to have them out there with no standards whatsoever, doing whatever they can. But in the absence of any federal legislation or support for the IRS in this area, it probably is better to have some minimum standards in some states asking preparers to be prepared than none as we go forward. But I would say that one of the things I've taken from this discussion is that you get a lot of different perspectives, very valuable ones from the panelists. And it does remind me again, as Andy and I were talking about the Security Summit, trying to work together to deal with identity theft and refund fraud. I think on both sides of the issue of both getting people enrolled in these programs, but also making sure that the improper payment rate goes down, I think it's an area, and the report makes some reference to that, glancing reference. I think it's a good area for really cooperation and coordination and really a partnership between the federal government, the Internal Revenue Service, and state and local governments and advocates to work together. Because as you hear the reports and the experiences from the panelists, you can see that there are important work being done in various ways. But it would be helpful if, again, a little like state national minimum standards, if we had an organized way of dealing with that. If it was easier to communicate with the IRS, it was easier to communicate and with lessons learned and promising practices across state boundaries. So I think in many ways, if we're going to increase the take-up rate from 80% for the EITC and 90% for the child tax credit, there are a lot of good ideas out there, and what we need to do is have a more effective kind of full court press. I used to, on January, we had EITC Awareness Month, and I used to go get 2 or 3 talks at public events around the country, and we tried to organize them everywhere. But it didn't really make much of a dent in the problem and the process. And so I think just listening today, it does say that we would probably make more progress if we could get all the organizations represented by the panelists working together on this problem.
Thank you. No, I couldn't agree more. And I know that we only have a few minutes left, so I really would love to take these remaining minutes to double down on that optimism, if you will. To really understand from each of the different perspectives that that we all represent here today. State and local government, the public, private, nonprofit sectors. Where are best practices happening? Where is the optimism, on the ground? And, especially understanding that our paper really uncovers so many of the longstanding challenges that have really plagued these credits, throughout their existence. Where do you see the optimism, in their future existing? So, Isabel, maybe I'll start with you and we can round robin from there.
Yeah, thank you. In Colorado, we've really found that cross promotion with other state agencies, especially those who administer benefits programs, has really been a surprising success. These state level levers, if you will, can reach a lot of people quickly. So we don't speak tax at the health department really, but partnering with the Department of Revenue for their tax expertise and their data support has been amazing. Other agencies that also address social needs, doing some cross promotion with them. One specific example would be placing a link to our tax campaign and links to how to file onto Colorado's unified benefits platform, where people can enroll in WIC and SNAP and all kinds of benefits. It's called PEAK, Colorado PEAK. So in just 2 weeks, that rose to our top level referral source immediately after we were able to place that link. Flyers mailed to our energy assistance program, widgets placed on the website for the online unemployment application page. Those are all programs housed in different state agencies. We worked with our health insurance marketplace to train the enrollment assisters to very briefly talk about tax filing and tax credits. And a lot of that is helping navigators feel comfortable in making that referral without getting bogged down in a tax conversation that they don't feel comfortable with. And there are ways to train people to feel that comfort, since it is a complex system. So I think I'm very optimistic about partnering, breaking down silos and working with new types of partners for public health and other agencies to help connect people to these cash payments.
Thank you. And Rebecca, same question for you. Is you're someone, to me, who exudes optimism, especially when we're talking about really challenging topics such as this.
Certainly. I don't think anybody would disagree that the COVID-19 pandemic has been just horrible for us all and for our country. But there have been a few bright lights that have emerged, particularly with regard to the IRS. They were tasked with distributing economic impact payments, advanced child tax credit payments, as well as, the expanded child tax credit payments. And they did so, not without a few bumps, not without a few hiccups, but they got the job done. And part of the reason why they were able to be successful was because they partnered with other government agencies like Social Security Administration, as well as the VA, and with our local partners as well. And so I think I'm optimistic about the fact that we have now set a standard. We've got a bar. We know that we can get things done. We know that the IRS can administer social services benefits, and that they've established and built upon public-private partnerships that they've already had, and they've established new public and private partnerships to help get the word out to those in the underserved communities. So I'm optimistic about the continuation of those partnerships and what we will see come out of those partnerships in the years coming. I'm really optimistic and excited about something that I heard last week at our Prosperity Summit, which is that the IRS is now extending services of the Taxpayer Assistance Centers once again to reach out into those rural and underserved communities, leveraging those community partnerships as well. And so we see that the IRS will be reaching more people just by going out to where the people are, meeting folks where they are, and extending those services to them. And so that really does make me excited. And then a couple other things. One is around the VITA program and how the VITA program expanded itself and extended itself during the pandemic to new ways of delivering services through, the online system. And so I think that's wonderful. And finally, that the IRS has funding for staff and to pay people and hire people to answer the phones. And so once we get those folks in place, I am excited about what is to come. Thank you so much, Richard.
No, of course. I mean, I always love leaving conversations on a high note, certainly. So I'm glad that we could do that today. And I truly hate to cut our conversation short, but I think we could all speak for another hour or two on this topic. But I really do want to thank all of our panelists today and the former commissioner for this robust discussion. I'd also like to thank the National Academy of Public Administration and its Center for Intergovernmental Partnerships for co-hosting today's event. All of you, please take care, and we look forward to hosting you for another event, whether virtual, hybrid, or in person here at BPC in the near future. Thank you all.
Take care.
Thank you.